thank you all for having me, and also I commend you for being indoors. It's really beautiful out here, and it was awesome getting here, although they did play the King's Speech on my flight over. I don't know who voted for that movie, but it was a good movie. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got to Facebook and how I got to the story of Facebook. I never set out to be a nonfiction writer. Nonfiction was never that interesting to me. I loved television, especially really bad TV. And I used to just sit at home and watch television, and so my parents installed a rule at home when I was a kid that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So I became a speed reader so that I could watch TV. And when I graduated from college, I decided I wanted to be a writer, so I locked myself in a room in Boston where I live, and I wrote 9 novels, and they were really crappy, and they were deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City, because that's what I thought writers wrote. And consequently, I was rejected by everyone in publishing. I got about 190 rejection slips, and I had them all over my walls. I was even rejected by a janitor at a publishing house because I sent to an editor who no longer worked there, and the janitor pulled it out of the garbage can and read it and then rejected me. So it shows you how well I was writing. And finally, an editor took pity on me, and he said, "Why don't you try to write a thriller?" So I went home, I read John Grisham, I read Michael Crichton and Robert Ludlum, and I thought I could do this. And this was the dawn of ER and the medical thriller. So I wrote a medical thriller. My dad's a doctor, and he helped me with the information. And it was a book called Threshold, and don't worry, none of you have ever heard of it, because it sold like 3 copies. I got a second book, and it was called Reaper, and again, none of you have ever heard of it. And it was about an evil scientist who implanted a computer virus, and it became a biological virus, and people started getting sick from their television sets. And I came up with the idea after watching a really bad episode of Oprah. That became a TV movie. It was called Fatal Error, which still airs at 2 in the morning. Really bad. It stars Antonio Sabato Jr., the underwear model, if you remember him. And he plays a surgeon, which was really great casting. And I remember there was a scene in the movie, and I'm sitting there watching it with my dad, and Antonio Sabato Jr. is leaning over a patient's chest, and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad looks at me and goes, "You know that's in the head, right?" So, I learned my first rule that the writer on a movie set is the lowest of the low. I actually had less power than the caterer. I remember I couldn't even get into the wrap party of my own TV movie unless I said I was part of Antonio Sabato Jr.'s entourage. So those were the lessons I was learning, and that's the stuff I was writing. I started hanging out in a bar in Boston, and this bar was called Crossroads, and it was your average kind of dive bar, except for it was right next to the school MIT, where all the geeky science guys were. And there was a group of college students who hung out there, and they looked like every other MIT kid, except for they had tons of money, and it was always in $100 bills. And in Boston, you never see $100 bills. I don't know about where you guys are from. In New York, sometimes you see $100 bills. In Vegas, they come out of the ATM machines. But in Boston, you never see big bills. And so I went up to the main kid, and I was like, "Why do you have so much money, and why is it in hundreds?" So he invites me to his house, and I get there, and stacked in his laundry was $250,000 in banded stacks of $100 bills. And I said, okay, this kid's got to be a drug dealer, right? But he was this smart math science kid. He just didn't look like a drug dealer. So I said, "Why do you have $250,000 in your laundry?" And he invited me to Vegas. So the next day, I got on a plane with him and 5 of his buddies, and they were all sitting in separate seats, and they were all pretending that they didn't know each other. And we landed in Las Vegas, and there was a uniformed driver in a big stretch limo. He picked us up. He brings us to this huge suite with a swimming pool. We had a butler. We didn't even know what to do with it, but we had a butler. And all the MIT kids, they start coming into the room, and they start pulling money out from under their clothes. And they had flown with $1 million in cash, had spread it out among them, flown to Vegas. They piled it up on the table in the suite, and they said, "We're the MIT Blackjack team." Now, I had heard of something called the Blackjack team when I was, in Boston, but I thought it was like a math club where they learned how to play blackjack. But the reality was, this had been going on for 25 years. These kids had made about $6 million beating Vegas. These secrets of blackjack had been handed down from group of students to group of students for 25 years. So I realized this was better than all the crap that I was writing. It just happened to be true. So I joined the MIT Blackjack team. I started going to Vegas every weekend, and I wrote the story that became the movie 21, the Vegas movie, which a lot of you have probably seen.